For centuries, the Middle East has been shaped by conflict that seems to echo from ancient times. Many trace its origins to the biblical story of Abraham's sons, Isaac and Ishmael. The prophecy found in Genesis 16 to 17 has been interpreted for generations as a metaphorical root of today's tensions, rather than a direct cause. This ancient narrative still influences how nations view land, borders, and identity. In this video, we'll follow the path from a family's desert struggles to the boundaries that divide nations today. Through animated lineage maps and historical visuals, you'll see how ancient clan divisions continue to influence modern borders. The story begins in the wilderness, where a single encounter changed the course of history. In the ancient world, the desert was more than a backdrop. It was a crucible for identity. The encounter between Hagar and the angel, recorded in Genesis 16, stands out as a pivotal turning point. Hagar, fleeing hardship, found herself by a spring, where she received a prophecy that would echo through generations. The angel's words were precise. Her son Ishmael would be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him. This phrase did not simply describe a temperament, it outlined a way of life. In the ancient Near East, the wild donkey symbolized nomadic independence, untamed, self-reliant, and difficult to subdue. Assyrian records from the 8th century BC document Arabian tribes whose movements and resistance to centralized control mirrored this very prophecy. These groups were known for their mobility, their ability to vanish into the desert, and their refusal to be easily governed. The wild donkey metaphor, then, was not just poetic. It matched the reality of tribal life that persists among Bedouin communities today. Their patterns of seasonal migration, reliance on oral tradition, and social cohesion all reflect the legacy of Ishmael's descendants as described in the ancient text. The prophecy's impact did not stop at lifestyle. The phrase, "his hand will be against everyone," carried geopolitical weight. Throughout history, Ishmaelite tribes often found themselves in tension with settled populations. Assyrian and later Roman sources describe recurring disputes and skirmishes with Arabian groups who resisted tribute and taxation. These patterns of opposition, first articulated in Genesis, became a recognizable feature of the region's history. Religious traditions have interpreted this desert encounter in distinct ways. Jewish midrash links the wild donkey image to Ishmael's survival skills and adaptability in harsh environments. Christian tradition, especially in Paul's letter to the Galatians, reinterprets the prophecy as a spiritual metaphor, contrasting flesh and spirit. Islamic exegesis, meanwhile, honors Ishmael as the co-founder of the Kaaba alongside Abraham, transforming the narrative of exile into one of divine purpose and blessing. Each tradition draws on the same prophecy, but gives it different meaning, shaping communal memory and identity. The story of the well where Hagar and Ishmael found water also holds special significance, especially in Islamic tradition. The well of Zamzam in Mecca, believed to have sprung forth to save them, remains a central symbol. The importance of water in this narrative is more than symbolic. Control over water sources has always been a source of contention in the region, a reality that persists in modern disputes over springs and wells. This desert encounter set in motion a pattern of division and resilience. The prophecy given to Hagar established a framework that would influence not only the descendants of Ishmael, but the region's entire approach to conflict, survival, and identity. As the story moved from the individual to the collective, it laid the groundwork for the next chapter, a rivalry between brothers that would shape the destinies of nations. Inheritance in the ancient Near East was more than a matter of wealth. It defined identity and determined a family's future. The birthright dispute between Ishmael and Isaac set a precedent that would shape both their destinies. Isaac's arrival, a miracle for Abraham and Sarah, disrupted the established order. In most families, the firstborn son would inherit a double portion and the right to lead, but Isaac's birth shifted the balance, drawing a sharp line between the two brothers. Sarah's insistence on sending Hagar and Ishmael away was not just personal. It reflected the legal and social realities of the time. Ancient adoption contracts from sites like Nuzi show that when a primary wife bore a child, any surrogate's offspring could lose their claim. Ishmael's departure was not simply exile. It was a formal separation from the inheritance and the covenant, forcing him and his descendants into a new existence on the margins. The wilderness became the crucible for Ishmael's lineage. Archaeological evidence from the Paran region, where Ishmael is said to have settled, shows temporary camps and wells supporting a nomadic lifestyle. These patterns stand in contrast to the agricultural settlements that developed in the hill country associated with Isaac's descendants. Over time, these differences in settlement, mobile encampments versus permanent villages, became markers of two distinct ways of life. The nomadic independence described in the prophecy about Ishmael is echoed in later records, such as Roman and Assyrian accounts of Arabian tribes who resisted central authority and thrived in harsh landscapes. The separation between the brothers was not absolute. Genesis describes a rare moment of unity at Abraham's funeral, with both sons coming together to bury their father. Yet this brief reconciliation did not erase the underlying divide. Ancient writings from Qumran hint at attempts at mediation, but the split remained. The legal codes of the region, such as those from Mesopotamia, required disinherited sons to leave the family territory, ensuring that the division was both physical and symbolic. Material culture further reinforced the split. Nomadic groups associated with Ishmael's line produced geometric pottery and portable artifacts, while settled communities linked to Isaac developed agricultural tools and more permanent structures. These differences reflected deeper cultural divides, how each group related to land, water, and authority. Water rights, in particular, became a source of contention. Isaac's descendants focused on reopening and maintaining wells, while Ishmael developed mobile water systems like qanats, allowing them to survive without fixed settlements. Religious traditions continued to shape the destinies of both groups. In later centuries, 7th century Muslim tradition would place Ishmael's binding near Mecca, establishing a spiritual claim that paralleled Isaac's legacy in Jerusalem and adding a new dimension to the rivalry over sacred spaces. Attempts by outside powers to impose boundaries rarely succeeded, such as the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, which tried to divide Anatolia but was met with strong local resistance, demonstrating the enduring strength of tribal and familial loyalties. Language and law also preserved the distinction. Hebrew and Arabic, both rooted in Proto-Semitic, developed different vocabularies for land, kinship, and ownership, reflecting the divergent experiences of settled and nomadic peoples. Even in the medieval period, legal documents from Cairo reveal that Jewish and Arab merchants used different forms for similar transactions, shaped by their respective traditions. The brief truce at Abraham's burial showed that peace was possible, but the underlying competition for legacy and land quickly re-emerged. The angel's prophecy foretold not just conflict, but the rise of two parallel civilizations, each with its own worldview and way of life. As the families grew into tribes and nations, these differences became the foundation for broader rivalries that would shape the region for generations. As the generations unfolded, the division between Ishmael's and Isaac's descendants shifted from a family matter to a rivalry that shaped entire nations. The tribes tracing their lineage to Ishmael spread across the Arabian Peninsula, forming loose confederations defined by independence and mobility. Their way of life, predicted in Genesis 16 verse 12, was not simply a matter of temperament. It became the organizing principle for their society. Roman sources describe how these groups refused census-taking and resisted outside control, holding fiercely to their autonomy. The Nabateans, likely descended from Ishmael, left a lasting mark in the region by building Petra. Unlike the agricultural settlements of Isaac's line, Petra's stone-carved facades and complex water systems reveal a people who adapted to the desert's harshness without abandoning their mobility. Their success in trade and engineering showed the prophecy's influence, as they flourished in places others avoided and maintained independence from empires that dominated settled lands. Meanwhile, Isaac's descendants developed a settled agricultural identity. Archaeological finds at Beersheba, grain storage pits, terraced fields, and boundary markers demonstrate a society rooted in the land. The Gezer calendar, with its record of crop cycles, points to a culture invested in permanence. Where Ishmaelite tribes moved with the seasons, the Israelites marked and defended territory, developing legal codes that governed land, water, and inheritance. These contrasting approaches often brought the two groups into conflict, especially along ancient trade routes. The King's Highway, which cut through Edom, became a point of friction as nomadic caravans and settled merchants vied for access and control. Assyrian and Roman records document repeated attempts to subdue Arabian tribes, only to find their mobility and knowledge of the terrain made them nearly impossible to conquer. The prophecy's vision of Ishmael's descendants as untamable and self-reliant played out in these historical encounters, as empires struggled to impose order on the desert's shifting alliances. The divide extended to land and resource management. Pre-Islamic poetry preserves the importance of grazing rights among Ishmaelite tribes, where use of land depended on seasonal patterns rather than fixed ownership. In contrast, Jewish legal tradition, as seen in the Mishnah, developed complex property laws for settled agriculture. Disputes over water rights near ancient wells continue to produce legal battles, echoing the ancient tension described in Genesis. Water itself became a focal point for rivalry. Nabatean engineers designed gravity-fed systems that could function without centralized oversight, while Israelite communities built communal reservoirs regulated by religious law. These patterns persist. Modern aerial surveys show Bedouin wells following traditional family lines, while Israeli agricultural cooperatives cluster around collective water sources. The landscape still reflects these ancient choices. Even the organization of society differed. Ishmaelite tribes governed by consensus, with sheiks leading through negotiation rather than decree. Greek and Roman historians noted the speed with which these groups could dissolve and reform alliances, a flexibility that frustrated imperial ambitions. In contrast, Israelite society emphasized continuity and legal order, a pattern that shaped their institutions for centuries. Language and cultural memory reinforced the separation. Arabic oral poetry developed as a means to preserve lineage and history without written records, while Hebrew's scribal tradition anchored memory in text. These distinctions shaped how each group understood their past and maintained their identity. Throughout the centuries, the prophecy's influence appeared not only in bloodlines, but in how people related to the land itself. The desert, the wells, and the trade routes became the stage for a rivalry that outlasted empires. As new powers arrived and old ones faded, the patterns set in motion by Ishmael and Isaac continued to shape the region's boundaries and its conflicts. The land still bears the imprint of these ancient divisions, from the carved stones of Petra to the wells of Beersheba. In the next chapter, the story turns to the physical landscape, where the cracked earth and contested springs reveal how history and prophecy continue to shape the destiny of those who call this place home. Across the Negev, the geography itself has become inseparable from the struggle for identity and survival. This region, where Hagar and Ishmael once wandered, has long been a battleground over scarce water and shifting boundaries. The land's dryness shapes every decision. Ancient tribal migration routes, visible in satellite images, still guide Bedouin movements today, echoing patterns set thousands of years ago. Each spring and well stands at the center of overlapping claims, its significance rooted in both memory and necessity. Beersheba's well, the site of Abraham's treaty with Abimelech, offers a window into these layered disputes. Archaeologists uncovered its ancient shaft beneath meters of debris, each stratum a record of repeated cycles: use, abandonment, and return. In the early 20th century, the British Mandate authorities redrew tribal boundaries in the Negev, disregarding traditional grazing patterns and imposing new administrative lines. This reconfiguration, documented in 1922, disrupted long-standing access to water and grazing, setting the stage for modern legal battles. The same well that once symbolized shared resource management now lies within urban infrastructure, its water rerouted, its meaning contested. The clash between nomadic and settled ways of life is not just a relic of the past. Bronze Age storage pits near Tel Arad show how agricultural communities invested in permanence, while nearby nomadic camps left only temporary traces. Ottoman-era land registries codified this divide, granting legal title to farmers and dismissing Bedouin lands as dead, a label that ignored their seasonal use. These administrative decisions deepened the rift, turning differences in land use into points of ongoing conflict. Water rights remain a persistent fault line. The Negev's aquifers, mapped and exploited for centuries, are still contested today. British records from the Mandate period list dozens of violent incidents tied to water access. Modern pipelines now crisscross the region, channeling water to new cities and settlements, much as ancient aqueducts once supplied places like Caesarea. Despite technological advances, the basic struggle, who controls the water, remains unchanged. Material culture preserves these divisions. Pottery fragments near sites like Ain el-Qudrat, associated with Hagar's journey, display patterns distinct from those found in settled areas. Bedouin weaving today continues these geometric motifs, a quiet assertion of identity in a landscape where permanence is rare. The boundaries of towns and encampments still reflect ancient preferences: formal grids for planned communities, organic clusters for mobile tribes. Attempts to impose fixed borders have rarely succeeded. The 1906 Ottoman British Commission recorded how Bedouin leaders described territory by seasonal use, not by lines on a map. Even after fences and roads appeared, nomadic groups continued to move along ancestral routes, adapting to barriers but never fully abandoning their patterns. The persistence of these movements, despite modern obstacles, echoes the prophecy's description of Ishmael's descendants as fiercely independent. Sacred geography heightens the stakes. Competing traditions locate Hagar's spring in different places: Zamzam in Mecca for Muslims, the Negev for Jews, but both invest in these sites with meaning beyond the physical. The debate over water becomes a debate over inheritance, promise, and identity. In courtrooms, technical arguments about aquifer levels mask the deeper question: who rightfully belongs to this land? The contest for the Negev is not just about territory or resources. It is a struggle over the meaning of history, prophecy, and belonging. These disputes, rooted in ancient stories and shaped by modern realities, set the context for the theological questions that continue to divide communities in the region. Within these contested lands, the question of inheritance takes on a deeper meaning, one that scholars call the Birthright paradox. At its core lies a divergence between two foundational texts, Genesis and the Quran. Genesis 22 verse 2 names Isaac as the son Abraham is commanded to sacrifice, establishing him as the bearer of the covenant in Jewish tradition. In contrast, the Quranic account, Surah 37 to 100-113, recounts Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son but does not name him, leaving generations of Muslim interpreters to identify Ishmael as the intended son. This ambiguity has become central to how each faith understands its origins and claims to the land. For Jews, the explicit naming of Isaac as the chosen son affirms their connection to the land of Israel and the enduring covenant with God. The story shapes Jewish identity, reinforcing the idea of a divinely sanctioned lineage that passes through Isaac. In Islamic tradition, the focus shifts. Ishmael's role is elevated not only through his association with the near sacrifice, but also through his partnership with Abraham in building the Kaaba in Mecca. This act, highlighted in the Quran, places Ishmael at the heart of Islamic faith and ritual, making him a spiritual ancestor for Muslims worldwide. Christian interpretations, while rooted in the Genesis narrative, often view the story as a prefiguration of later theological developments, emphasizing faith and obedience rather than lineage alone. Each tradition, then, draws from the same ancient narrative, but finds in it a different message about divine favor and inheritance. The paradox deepens when examining how these traditions have responded to the ethical challenges of the story. Jewish commentators have long struggled with the apparent harshness of Ishmael's expulsion, especially given the broader biblical emphasis on caring for the vulnerable. Rabbinic literature sometimes reimagines Ishmael's character, highlighting his virtues or suggesting his later repentance, reflecting an ongoing effort to reconcile the story's ethical tensions. Islamic scholarship, meanwhile, interprets the sacrifice narrative as a demonstration of submission to God's will, with Ishmael depicted as a willing participant. This emphasis on obedience and shared purpose between father and son shapes the annual rituals of Eid al-Adha and underscores the importance of trust in divine wisdom. Despite these differences, both traditions recognize the significance of Abraham's test and the lasting impact on their respective communities. The question of who holds the true birthright remains unresolved, fueling debates not only over theology, but also over land, identity, and belonging. Manuscript illuminations, legal codes, and oral traditions all reflect the enduring complexity of this paradox, as each community seeks to affirm its place in the unfolding story. The birthright paradox is not simply a relic of ancient texts. It continues to inform how communities view themselves and each other today. As the region's history unfolds, the tension between shared ancestry and competing claims shapes both daily life and the broader patterns of conflict and coexistence. This unresolved question, who truly inherits the promise, creates a foundation for the next chapter, where empires themselves become entangled in the legacy of this ancient rivalry. Imperial ambitions have long intersected with the ancient prophecy about Ishmael's descendants, shaping the history of the Middle East in ways both subtle and direct. As early as 850 BC, Assyrian inscriptions mention Jin-Dabu the Arab, whose 1,000 camels supported a military coalition. These records provide the first secular evidence of Arab tribes operating as independent military powers, already displaying the mobile tactics and resistance to subjugation that echo the biblical portrait of Ishmael's line. Assyrian rulers, from Shalmaneser III to Tiglath-Pileser III, launched repeated campaigns against these tribes, only to find that victories were temporary. The desert's mobility and tribal autonomy, foretold in Genesis, meant that every attempt at conquest sparked fresh cycles of rebellion. Persian administrators encountered the same challenge. Herodotus records that Darius I could not extract tribute from the Arabian interior, and the Persians built their famed royal road to bypass tribes that refused imperial control. Even after the fall of Persia, when Alexander the Great swept across the region, the Arabians alone withheld submission. Strabo recounts that Alexander's plans for a campaign against them were interrupted by his death, leaving the question of their conquest unresolved. The Roman and later Byzantine empires also struggled to impose order. Roman military records detail the cost and frustration of patrolling Arabia Patria. Legions required vast logistical support to guard trade routes, and special units, called Arabicus, faced continual skirmishes. The Notitia Dignitatum lists these units, but casualty reports and requests for reinforcements reveal the persistence of tribal resistance. Byzantine efforts to Christianize the region often backfired. Missionary activity sometimes strengthened tribal cohesion rather than dissolving it, as seen with the Ghassanid Arabs, who maintained their own ecclesiastical structures despite alliance with Constantinople. The prophecy's influence is visible in the way these empires adapted. Reliefs from Nineveh show Arab warriors as both tributaries and adversaries, a duality mirrored in later imperial records. Archaeological layers at Roman forts display repeated destruction and rebuilding, evidence of ongoing conflict. The persistence of tribal autonomy, even in the face of overwhelming force, reinforced the image of Ishmael's descendants as untamable and fiercely independent. The rise of Islam in the 7th century marked a transformation, but not a resolution. Arab tribes, united under a new religious banner, rapidly expanded across North Africa and the Middle East. Yet, the old patterns endured. The Rashidun Caliphate incorporated tribal structures into its military organization, adapting Bedouin raiding tactics for conquest. Internal divisions soon surfaced, especially after the First Islamic Civil War, as tribes reasserted their independence against centralized authority. These dynamics echoed the prophecy's warnings and the historical record of resistance to the empire. Biblical prophecy continued to frame imperial encounters. The books of Daniel chapter 2 and Ezekiel chapter 38 describe visions of empires rising and falling, with the beast, or revived Roman power, playing a central role. Daniel 11 verses 40 to 43 speaks of the king of the north invading the glorious land, an act reminiscent of Roman campaigns in the region. These texts, interpreted by later generations, reinforced the sense that imperial ambitions would always meet resistance in this land, and that the struggle between settled power and nomadic autonomy would persist. Even as the Ottoman and British empires imposed new administrative boundaries, the fundamental patterns remained unchanged. Ottoman tax registers from the Hejaz show chronic difficulties collecting revenue, and British officers in World War I reported the limits of modern warfare against tribal fighters who could disappear into the desert. Attempts to build infrastructure, whether railways or pipelines, regularly encountered sabotage or negotiation with tribal leaders, reflecting the ongoing reality that outside powers could not simply redraw the map or impose order from above. These cycles of conquest and resistance, shaped by both prophecy and geography, set the stage for the 20th century. As new powers entered the region and old borders shifted, the ancient rivalry that began in the desert continued to influence every negotiation, every claim, and every attempt at peace. In the 20th century, the ancient threads of rivalry found new expression through modern geopolitics. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 marked a decisive moment, as British officials promised support for a Jewish national home in Palestine, while also pledging not to harm the civil and religious rights of the region's non-Jewish communities. This dual commitment set the stage for conflicting claims, each rooted in generations of attachment to the land. Under the British Mandate, Jewish immigration surged, transforming the demographic landscape and intensifying long-standing tensions between communities with competing historical narratives. As the British Mandate drew to a close, the United Nations proposed partitioning Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem placed under international administration. This plan, outlined in Resolution 181, was accepted by Jewish leaders but rejected by Arab representatives, who saw the proposed division as unjust. The events that followed, the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, redrew boundaries and displaced hundreds of thousands of people. For Jewish communities, the establishment of Israel represented a return to an ancestral homeland and the fulfillment of ancient promises. For Palestinians and many Arabs, it marked the beginning of dispossession and exile, known as the Nakba. Subsequent decades saw the region shaped by a series of major conflicts. The Suez Crisis in 1956, the Six-Day War in 1967, the Yom Kippur War of 1973, the Lebanon War in 1982, and the conflict with Hezbollah in 2006. Each war altered borders, deepened mistrust, and left unresolved the core questions of territory and identity. The Six-Day War, in particular, resulted in Israel occupying the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights, bringing new populations under Israeli control and intensifying disputes over land and resources. International efforts to resolve the conflict have often focused on territorial compromise. United Nations Resolutions 242 and 338 called for withdrawal from occupied territories and the establishment of peace, but the underlying issues, competing claims to land, memory, and legitimacy remained. Negotiations such as the Oslo Accords in the 1990s aimed to create a framework for coexistence. Yet the process faltered as both sides struggled to reconcile modern realities with deep-seated historical grievances. These geopolitical developments have not erased the influence of ancient patterns. Settlement locations, legal arguments, and even the boundaries proposed by international bodies at times echo the tribal and territorial divisions described in early sources. Disputes over water rights, for example, continue to mirror the conflicts over wells and springs that shaped the region's history. Economic disparities, patterns of urbanization, and the persistence of oral traditions reflect the enduring contrast between settled and nomadic ways of life. Religious sites remain focal points for tension. The Temple Mount, or Haram al-Sharif, contains layers of history that draw the attention of multiple faiths, each with its own narrative and claim. Agreements over access and administration frequently revisit arrangements that have existed, in some form, for centuries. Education and public memory further entrench division. School curricula on both sides emphasize particular historical periods and omit others, shaping how new generations understand their place in a contested landscape. Demographic trends, migration policies, and the language of return all reinforce the sense that the past is never distant from present realities. Modern conflict resolution efforts often address immediate political or security concerns, but the persistence of ancient disputes over land and water reveals deeper currents at work. These underlying issues continue to shape the choices of leaders and communities, ensuring that the region's history remains a living force. Beneath the surface of every negotiation and every border, the struggle for resources, especially water, remains as urgent as ever. The next chapter in this story unfolds along the riverbanks and springs that have sustained life for millennia, where the echoes of ancient disputes still ripple through the present. Competition for water has always shaped the politics and daily life of the Middle East. Nowhere is this more visible than along the Jordan River, where modern allocation agreements divide its flow among Israel, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. These arrangements echo ancient treaties, with each group seeking to secure enough water for survival and prosperity. The river's shrinking volume, once over 1 billion cubic meters a year, now a fraction of that, reflects the mounting pressure on this essential resource. Scarcity here is not new. It is a recurring theme that has driven conflict from the earliest days, when disputes over wells and springs often led to confrontation. Legal frameworks for water rights have deep roots. Ancient cuneiform texts describe penalties for unauthorized use of wells, and similar principles guide water law in the region today. The story of Abraham and Abimelech at Beersheba set a precedent for arbitration over shared resources, a model still referenced in contemporary legal disputes. Ottoman-era court records from Jerusalem show that terminology and logic from biblical accounts continue to inform modern rulings. Access to water is not just a matter of infrastructure. It is a matter of identity, justice, and survival. Despite advances in technology, the symbolic value of natural water sources remains strong. The National Water Carrier Pipeline, which brings water to Tel Aviv, follows routes established by ancient aqueducts. Pilgrims continue to visit Jordan's baptism sites, even as the river's water is often supplemented by municipal supplies. The persistence of tradition reveals how deeply water is woven into the spiritual and cultural landscape. Archaeological evidence links the location of Hagar's spring near Kadesh Barnea to repeated waves of migration and settlement. Excavations reveal layers of use, with pottery and other artifacts marking the passage of different peoples. Even today, Bedouin groups recognize these sites, returning seasonally as their ancestors did. Modern border changes have altered water availability, but the underlying patterns of movement and use remain. Current treaties and proposals for water sharing often mirror ancient boundaries. The 1994 Israel-Jordan peace agreement's water provisions reflect earlier allocations found in historical records. Palestinian claims to water rights frequently align with irrigation boundaries documented in ancient letters. Satellite imagery shows that agricultural use still follows these inherited lines, even as political borders shift. The collapse of Gaza's aquifer is a stark example of how overuse and mismanagement can lead to crisis. Saltwater intrusion has rendered most wells undrinkable, a situation reminiscent of biblical warnings about failed water sources. Contemporary projects to address the crisis often repeat older patterns, prioritizing urban needs over rural, echoing ancient disputes between coastal and inland communities. Hydrological studies continue to reveal connections between prophecy and present reality. Rainfall patterns and aquifer locations often match descriptions in biblical texts, and geological surveys identify fault lines that correspond to ancient spring sites. Water management systems developed by earlier civilizations, such as Nabatean runoff collectors, are still studied and sometimes adapted for modern use. In times of drought, the language of protest and complaint often turns to scripture. Banners quoting passages about selective rainfall and divine intervention appear at demonstrations. Water authorities use data models that, whether intentionally or not, reflect traditional agricultural cycles preserved in religious texts. Nomadic groups continue to rely on secret wells, passing knowledge through generations and adapting to changes in the landscape. Efforts to locate these sources with modern technology often fail, highlighting the persistence of traditional strategies. Disputes over water rights, whether settled in courtrooms or negotiated on the ground, draw on a history that stretches back millennia. Some sites, like the spring associated with Hagar, have become places of cooperation despite political division. Joint conservation efforts at these locations have endured when other agreements have not, suggesting that shared dependence on water can sometimes bridge even the deepest divides. Underlying all of these struggles is the ancient prophecy that speaks of conflict, resilience, and survival. The patterns established in the search for water have shaped not only the region's history, but also its future. As resources grow scarcer and competition intensifies, the lessons of the past remain as relevant as ever. But water is only one part of the larger picture. Another force, equally rooted in prophecy and history, continues to shape the region's destiny, one that is measured not in rivers or wells, but in the growing numbers of people who call this land home. Population growth in the region has become a force as significant as any natural resource or border. The prophecy given to Hagar in Genesis 16 verse 10, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count," finds a striking echo in the demographic realities of the modern Middle East. Arab population growth rates continue to outpace global averages, with the Palestinian territories projected to reach nearly 9.5 million people by 2050. Fertility rates in Gaza remain among the highest in the region, and even as Jewish fertility rates in Israel have risen, the overall demographic balance continues to shift. These numbers are not abstract. They shape policy decisions, economic planning, and even the daily rhythms of life in cities and villages alike. The persistence of tribal and familial identity is another enduring legacy of Ishmael's descendants. Diaspora communities across the world, whether in South America, North America, Europe, or Australia, often maintain language, customs, and religious practices that trace back to their ancestral roots. In Brazil, for example, millions of Arab descendants have preserved clan-based social structures adapted from Levantine village life. In Detroit, Chaldean communities continue to observe marriage customs with deep historical roots. Even in the Australian outback, Bedouin water-finding techniques have been passed down and adapted to new environments. These practices are more than cultural artifacts. They are mechanisms for preserving identity across generations and continents. Demographic trends are not uniform across the region. Urban and rural communities show distinct patterns, with cities often experiencing lower fertility rates than rural areas. In the West Bank, for instance, Hebron's birth rate remains significantly higher than that of Ramallah, reflecting the ancient divide between settled and nomadic lifestyles. Refugee populations, particularly in Jordan, continue to grow at a faster pace than host communities, a phenomenon that echoes demographic patterns established centuries ago. These differences create new political and social pressures, as governments and aid organizations struggle to accommodate rapid changes in population. Education and social institutions reinforce these trends. Jordan's school curricula, for example, emphasize tribal histories alongside national narratives, while Palestinian schools in Lebanon preserve village dialects that linguists can trace back to ancient Galilean Aramaic. In Israel, Arab schools incorporate agricultural problems rooted in medieval Islamic geometry. Such educational choices help maintain a sense of continuity, even as communities adapt to new circumstances. Economic systems have also adapted to demographic realities. In the Gulf states, labor policies often favor Arab citizens for government jobs, while relying on migrant labor for other sectors. Remittance patterns among Palestinian workers follow migration cycles that have existed since the Bronze Age. These adaptations reflect both the opportunities and the challenges presented by rapid population growth. Medical research has uncovered inherited biological adaptations among populations in the region, such as genetic mutations for efficient water retention in Negev Bedouin communities. These findings point to the ways in which survival strategies, developed in the desert environment, continue to influence health outcomes today. The demographic shifts unfolding in the Middle East carry political consequences that are deeply intertwined with the region's history and prophecy. Each rise in population brings with it new demands for housing, education, and resources, pressures that can strain already fragile infrastructures and exacerbate existing tensions. The prophecy's promise of a people too numerous to count is visible not only in census data, but in the crowded streets, expanding neighborhoods, and the persistent sense of competition for space and opportunity. As societies adapt to these demographic realities, the patterns of identity, loyalty, and conflict established in the earliest days continue to surface in new forms. The legacy of the prophecy is not confined to population growth alone. It shapes how communities organize themselves, how they relate to one another, and how they respond to challenges both old and new. These population dynamics, set in motion by ancient words and sustained by generations of tradition, have also influenced the ways in which communities defend themselves and assert their independence. The next chapter reveals how these demographic patterns have left their mark on the region's military strategies, echoing the prophecy's vision of resilience and defiance. Throughout history, the military strategies of groups in the Middle East have been shaped by the landscapes they inhabit and the legacies they carry. The Bedouin tradition, marked by mobility and adaptability, continues to influence the tactics seen in conflicts today. Warfare among Ishmael's descendants has long relied on using the environment as both shield and advantage. Ancient accounts describe how nomadic fighters would vanish into the desert after swift raids, making pursuit nearly impossible for armies accustomed to conventional battle lines. This approach, rooted in the need to survive in harsh, unpredictable terrain, remains evident in modern guerrilla tactics. Contemporary militant groups, such as those operating in Gaza and southern Lebanon, draw on these traditions. Tunnel networks allow fighters to move unseen, launching attacks and disappearing before a response can be mounted. The use of terrain, whether the rocky hills of Lebanon or the narrow alleyways of urban camps, mirrors the ancient preference for positions that favor surprise and rapid withdrawal. Even the timing of attacks, often coordinated with weather patterns or seasonal changes, reflects a deep understanding of the land's rhythms. Israel's military responses have adapted in direct relation to these tactics. The Israel Defense Forces have developed doctrines and technologies specifically designed to counter mobility and unpredictability. The Merkava tank, for example, features design elements that allow for quick exit and redeployment, a response to lessons learned from facing ambushes in difficult terrain. The Iron Dome missile defense system was created to address the challenge of short-range rocket fire, using advanced tracking to intercept projectiles, patterns familiar from historical accounts of desert warfare. Both sides employ tracking and counter-tracking methods that have origins in nomadic life. Bedouin trackers, skilled in reading subtle changes in sand and soil, are now part of modern border patrols. Their expertise in detecting movement across open ground is valued for identifying infiltrations along routes that have served as smuggling and raiding paths for centuries. The circular defensive layouts of militant encampments in remote areas echo the designs of pre-Islamic desert camps, intended to maximize visibility and response time in case of attack. Air and cyber operations also reflect these patterns. Adversaries use environmental factors, such as sandstorms or cloud cover, to reduce the effectiveness of surveillance and airstrikes. Cyber units, structured in decentralized networks, mirror the flexibility of tribal alliances, making them difficult to disrupt through conventional means. Israeli cyber defense and intelligence strategies incorporate predictive models based on the decision-making patterns observed in nomadic societies. Urban warfare in the region often adopts the irregular layouts of ancient settlements, creating confusion for advancing forces. The blending of fighters into civilian populations draws on a long history of using local knowledge and social ties to evade capture. Materials and construction methods in conflict zones sometimes intentionally mimic those from earlier eras, exploiting weaknesses in modern weaponry. The tools of war, from small arms to improvised rockets, often show adaptations for the local environment, prioritizing reliability in sand and heat over technological sophistication. Even naval operations along the coastlines employ tactics reminiscent of historic raids, using speed and surprise to offset larger adversaries. Attempts to impose order or enforce peace frequently overlook these enduring military patterns. Ceasefire agreements may falter because they do not account for the seasonal or social dynamics that drive conflict. Disarmament efforts can fail when they ignore the role of weapons as markers of status and security within tribal structures. The military strategies that persist in the region are not relics of the past. They are living systems, continually shaped by the demands of geography, history, and identity. These patterns, forged through centuries of adaptation, continue to influence the outcomes of conflict and the prospects for stability. As the region's societies engage in ongoing competition and cooperation, the same principles that govern movement and defense on the battlefield also appear in other spheres of life, setting the stage for the economic contrasts that follow. Economic contrasts in the Middle East are rooted in the same historical patterns that have long defined the descendants of Ishmael and Isaac. The region's economies reflect the ancient divide between nomadic resource-based systems and settled, diversified models. In nations tracing their heritage to Ishmael, economic structures often prioritize resource extraction, particularly oil and gas, mirroring the mobility and adaptability of nomadic life. Gulf states distribute wealth through networks that favor tribal and familial loyalty, with leadership frequently channeling resources directly to trusted groups rather than through transparent, institutional processes. This approach preserves the cohesion and independence described in the earliest prophecies, but it also perpetuates cycles of privilege and exclusion. Israel, whose economic foundations are linked to the settled traditions of Isaac's descendants, has developed a different trajectory. The country's focus on agriculture and technology stems from ancient practices of land cultivation and innovation. Modern Israeli industry is built on a foundation of value-added production, from advanced irrigation to high-tech startups. The structure of the Israeli economy encourages diversification, risk-taking, and the integration of skilled immigrants, drawing on a legacy of adapting to new circumstances while maintaining strong communal bonds. Attempts to diversify economies in oil-rich nations have met with mixed results. Despite ambitious plans and investments in technology and infrastructure, many Gulf states remain reliant on hydrocarbons for the majority of their revenue. Efforts like Saudi Vision 2030 highlight the desire to move beyond oil, but the underlying economic relationships remain deeply influenced by tribal and familial structures. Foreign labor continues to play a central role, with millions of workers moving through the region without ever fully integrating, a pattern that echoes the ancient use of specialized, temporary laborers. Traditional economic practices are visible beneath the surface of modern financial systems. In Jordan, small businesses often operate using informal agreements based on clan honor, while in Israel, business transactions sometimes draw on communal trust networks that have persisted for generations. Banking systems reflect these differences as well. Islamic finance, rooted in 7th century trade principles, prohibits interest and emphasizes profit sharing, while Israeli banks incorporate elements from European mercantile traditions and Jewish legal codes. Resource distribution continues to follow ancient patterns. In Saudi Arabia, water and land rights are often allocated based on tribal history, while in Israel, infrastructure investments frequently align with historical settlement patterns. The persistence of these traditions shapes not only who has access to resources, but also how communities respond to economic change and crisis. Consumer behavior and tourism further illustrate the divide. Bargaining remains common in Arab markets, reflecting the importance of personal relationships and negotiation, while Israeli retail often favors fixed pricing and efficiency. Tourism infrastructure in the Gulf emphasizes luxury and exclusivity, whereas in Israel, historical authenticity and spiritual significance are prioritized. The economic divide is not just about wealth or resources. It is about the systems and values that have developed over centuries. Revelation 17 verses 1-14 describes a harlot seated on a beast, symbolizing the entanglement of wealth, power, and spiritual conflict in the world's final era. Revelation 13 introduces the beast and false prophet, whose influence is tied to global commerce and control. These images echo the ongoing struggle between competing economic models and visions for society, suggesting that the divide is as much about identity and destiny as it is about material prosperity. As the region continues to evolve, these economic distinctions remain deeply embedded, shaping opportunities, expectations, and the ways in which communities interact with one another. The legacy of ancient rivalry is not confined to borders or resources. It extends into the psychological frameworks that inform how people see themselves and their place in the world. Patterns of belief and behavior in the region trace back to the story of Isaac and Ishmael, shaping how communities understand themselves and their neighbors. The psychological legacy of this narrative runs deep, influencing everything from early education to daily rituals. For many Israeli children, lessons in school center on the idea of a unique covenant, reinforced by stories highlighting Isaac's role in the biblical promise. Meanwhile, Palestinian youth often grow up hearing accounts of ancestral loss and rightful inheritance, passed down through family storytelling. These parallel narratives activate strong emotional responses, as seen in studies where both groups react intensely to symbols and maps tied to their histories. Cultural traditions further entrench these perspectives. Jewish holidays and rituals frequently recall the binding of Isaac, embedding the story in collective memory. In Islamic practice, Ishmael's role as a foundational figure in Mecca's history is emphasized, lending spiritual significance to his legacy. Such narratives do more than teach history. They guide social behaviors and economic patterns. Israeli business culture, for example, often values innovation and risk, echoing themes of agricultural renewal, while Arab business networks rely on kinship and honor, reflecting a nomadic heritage. Education systems play a central role in maintaining these divides. Textbooks and curricula on both sides highlight selective aspects of history, developing distinct collective memories. Israeli students may spend significant time studying periods tied to Jewish sovereignty, while Palestinian curricula emphasize ancient Canaanite roots and the continuity of Arab presence. These educational choices shape how young people perceive the land and their place within it, leading to cognitive frameworks that can be difficult to reconcile. Unconscious biases also emerge from this legacy. Psychological testing reveals that individuals from both groups more readily associate positive qualities with their own ancestral symbols. Neuroimaging studies show that exposure to the other side's national emblems or anthems can trigger stress responses, even among those who advocate for peace. These reactions suggest that the legacy of the Isaac and Ishmael narrative is not only taught, but also deeply embedded on a psychological level. Religious practices reinforce these patterns in subtle ways. The timing and orientation of Jewish and Islamic prayers, for instance, reflect ancient relationships to land and movement. These rituals encode a sense of belonging and connection to territory, shaping physical habits that persist across generations. Childhood development follows different paths as well. Desert navigation skills are valued in Bedouin communities, while textual analysis is emphasized in Jewish education, each reflecting adaptations to historical environments. Language and art also preserve these ancient worldviews. The structure of Hebrew and Arabic, along with the imagery found in poetry and music, continues to reflect the contrasting experiences of settled and nomadic life. Even in contemporary culture, these differences remain visible, influencing how stories are told and how identity is expressed. Yet, the psychological legacy is not solely a source of division. The story of Isaac and Ishmael contains a moment of shared humanity. Both brothers come together to bury their father Abraham. Genesis 25 verse 9, providing a rare example of cooperation and respect. This act stands as a reminder that reconciliation, though difficult, is possible. It suggests that the narrative shaping so much of the region's identity can also offer a foundation for peace. Understanding the psychological impact of these stories is essential for anyone seeking to address the conflict's deeper roots. The patterns established by the Isaac and Ishmael legacy continue to shape responses to new challenges and opportunities. Recognizing this influence opens the door to approaches that move beyond entrenched opposition, setting the stage for efforts that take the power of narrative into account. Breaking the cycle of conflict in the Middle East requires more than treaties or technological advances. It asks for a reckoning with the legacy of prophecy that still shapes borders, water rights, and the stories people tell about themselves and their neighbors. The patterns set in motion by the ancient rivalry between Isaac and Ishmael continue to surface in the region's daily realities. Where some see only political or economic disputes, others recognize the persistence of a narrative that has been passed down for generations, informing identity, loyalty, and even hope. Efforts to move beyond this cycle have found greater traction when they acknowledge the power of these stories. Peace initiatives that incorporate historical and religious narratives, rather than sidestepping them, often see stronger results. The Abraham Accords, for example, opened the door for new economic and diplomatic ties by framing cooperation as a return to shared ancestry. Interfaith dialogues that address the scriptural roots of division, especially the roles of Ishmael and Isaac, have helped participants find common ground. These conversations do not erase differences, but they create space for empathy and understanding where suspicion once prevailed. Joint projects in archaeology, education, and culture have begun to chip away at inherited mistrust. When Israeli and Palestinian teams work together to uncover ancient sites, they are not just recovering artifacts. They are building a shared sense of stewardship over the land's layered history. Educational reforms that present multiple narratives side by side allow young people to see that the story is not singular, but woven from many perspectives. Artistic collaborations, music, theater, and literature offer new ways to engage with the past, often reaching audiences untouched by formal negotiations. Practical cooperation, especially around shared resources like water, has also shown promise. Agreements that draw on traditional models of seasonal sharing, rather than imposing rigid ownership, tend to last longer and enjoy broader support. Economic partnerships that blend the strengths of settled and nomadic traditions have demonstrated resilience in the face of rapid change. These models show that it is possible to honor the distinct contributions of each group while working toward common goals. Underlying these efforts is a growing recognition that the prophecy's power lies not only in its description of conflict, but in its potential to point the way toward transformation. By seeing the Isaac-Ishmael dynamic as a system shaped by both division and reconciliation, communities can begin to imagine new possibilities. The story of the brothers coming together at Abraham's burial serves as a reminder that even the deepest rifts are not beyond repair. The enduring influence of ancient prophecy is visible in every negotiation, every dispute over land or water, and every attempt to build bridges across divides. As long as these stories remain central to identity, they will continue to shape the region's future. Yet, there is evidence that this legacy can be harnessed for peace as well as for conflict. The challenge and the opportunity lies in recognizing how deeply the prophecy runs, and in choosing to write a new chapter that honors both the past and the hope for something different. The question remains, will these ancient patterns continue to dictate the course of history, or can a new understanding finally break the cycle? The answer may depend on how willing people are to reflect on the legacy they have inherited and to see themselves not only as heirs to conflict, but as potential authors of reconciliation. The ancient rivalry between the descendants of Ishmael and Isaac continues to shape the realities of the modern Middle East. From water disputes that trace their origins to biblical wells, to military and economic patterns that echo ancient nomadic and settled traditions, the influence of this prophecy is visible in daily life, national policies, and regional alliances. The ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, sectarian divisions, and struggles over land and resources all carry the imprint of this enduring legacy. Recent initiatives that recognize the depth of this shared history, such as joint educational programs and collaborative archaeological projects, have shown that understanding the roots of conflict can open doors to cooperation. Economic partnerships that blend the strengths of both traditions often yield more resilient outcomes. How do you see the legacy of Ishmael and Isaac reflected in current events? Share your thoughts in the comments about where this ancient narrative continues to influence today's world.